Some of the main theses that you propound in this book, and when I say thesis, I think I should be careful to say finding, really, rather than a thesis. It isn't a hypothesis. These are findings, or you assert that they are.
Yes, in other words, it is a history book. It is not a political book. It is not a message book.
Or speculation.
No. At the end of the book, I have one chapter in which I try to draw some conclusions from what's gone before. But there's less politics in this book, for example, than in many of the reviews of the book that I've read.
Well, let's start in on the so-called myths of the Anglo-Saxons. It is widely supposed that the Anglo-Saxon is king in America, right?
Yes.
Now, in what sense do you disprove this?
Well, in terms just of sheer numbers, that Anglo-Saxons are about 15% of the population. So the notion of speaking of an Anglo-Saxon majority and then the various minorities around them seems a little ludicrous when you call 15% a majority and you call 13 or 12% a minority. In terms of income, Anglo-Saxons have about 5 or 6% higher incomes than the national average. But there are other groups, such as the Chinese, who have 12% higher, and Japanese, who have 32% higher, and Jews are higher than that. So that the notion that the Anglo-Saxons are remarkable is not borne out by the data.
Well, what about the Anglo-Saxon occupying the select professions? There are, I think you said, 15% so-called professional activities, teaching, lawyering, doctoring, so
Yes.
forth. Now, how do the Anglo-Saxons make out on that score?
You have me at a disadvantage. The book does not include a chapter on Anglo-Saxons, and the data don't come to mind that readily. I don't recall anything particularly startling in the numbers as I went through them.
Well, you mentioned that 14 is average. West Indians come in at 15. i.e. 15% of West Indians are lawyers, doctors, or teachers, whereas only 14% of whites are. 18% of Japanese are. 23% of Filipinos are, and 25% of Chinese are. So right there, an awful lot of icons have been busted, haven't they?
Yes, yes. Yeah. It's amazing because the data that I use are typically data that have been in existence for some time and available to anyone who cared to go look it up rather than simply repeat what's been said before.
Okay, now we want to look into some of the causes of high reimbursement for one's work and low reimbursement for one's work. It is generally, for instance, assumed that the white man makes a lot more than the black man. You go on to say this is only in part true. Would you elaborate on that?
Yes, that it's true in general. If you then try to find out why is it true simply because all blacks or a substantial part of blacks, regardless of education, cannot get jobs in their professions? The recent data, and this would not necessarily apply 20 or 30 years ago, the recent data indicate, for example, that black West Indians earn 94% of the income of the average American. If you take second generation black West Indians, they earn higher incomes than Anglo-Saxons. And so it's very hard to make the argument that the white employer is looking into the genealogy of the black job applicant. It's very doubtful if he has any interest in it, much less that he's inquiring into it. It's simply that other people who make that inquiry find these kinds of differences, which you then cannot attribute to the employer because he's probably totally unaware of the whole situation.
And by the same token, the employer is in many instances not equipped to discriminate, say, against a Puerto Rican, even if he wanted to, right? Because there are no visual differences between.
Well, with Puerto Ricans,
Mexicans. Right?
There would be with some, and with others there would not be. Yeah. But again, it's quite easy to tell that black West Indians are black, and yet that doesn't seem to have the income effect that you would expect on the basis of the prevailing theories.
Or that Chinese are colored or different from white.
Yes, yes.
And now there you go into some subsections. You point out that depending on where you come from in a foreign country also makes a considerable difference because you carry your ethos on your back, don't you?
Yes, that if you look at the Chinese who came to the United States, let's say before World War II, a very large percentage of those came from one district in one province in southern China. They brought with them an old tradition which has existed in the United States, perhaps more so than it does in China itself today. The people who've come in since World War II have largely not come from that same area. They've come in with a different set of experiences and backgrounds and values. Many of them are the poverty-stricken Chinese that you see in the Chinatowns of New York and San Francisco, working the very long hours, getting the very low pay, living in the slums, packed into the rooms, you know, several people to a room and so on. Again, it would be hard to make the argument that this is simply a matter of the way the American employer sees it. The American employer is probably totally unaware that there are two different kinds of Chinese. It's only the people who work with the data who make those separations and find this drastic difference. But the argument that this must derive from the employer simply won't stand up to the facts.
And the implications of that statement alone have, of course, to do with the sensitivity of the market, right?
Yes.
The market mechanism, as I understand it, is most reluctant to discriminate because it isn't interested in the color of a person's skin or his background, but is very much interested in what he will perform.
Well, the market puts a price on discrimination.
Yeah,
there are people who will pay that price and continue to discriminate.
Yeah.
But even in South Africa, if you look at the history of discrimination in South Africa, you find that there was less of it, let us say, around 1920, 1910, than there has been in recent decades. One of the reasons being that before the Nationalist Party first came to power in the 1920s, market forces had much more effect in South Africa than they do today. And it's been necessary in South Africa for the Nationalist Party to maintain its apartheid policies, to engage in a massive government intervention in the market, repeatedly tightening up loopholes and so forth, because the employers tend to look for the loopholes. If there are blacks available at a lower price, it's to the employer's advantage to find the loophole. And in South Africa, ironically, there is a quota system for whites, so that the employer has a certain minimum number of whites he must hire, and the employers do everything they can to evade those
In that direct
quotas.
sense, they are paying for discrimination.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. But the employers tend, if they can get away with it, to hire more blacks rather than less.
Now, you mentioned that characteristically, it has been government that has enforced discrimination. We know that's true, of course, in the Oriental societies. We know it was true here right through and including Jim Crow. It was
Yes.
here for the Navy. You pointed out that 25% of John Paul Jones' Navy was black, but none of the people in World War II in certain.
Well, in 1930, there were no blacks at all in the Navy, but in 1812, John Paul Jones had a crew that was 25% black.
Yeah.
So it's a tremendous retrogression in that respect.
Yeah, well, now, it's easy enough to understand that an agent that exercises coercive power could be driven to these rather nefarious purposes. Less easy to understand why it is that colleges and foundations should be guilty of such behavior. Yet this exactly was your finding, wasn't
Yes,
it?
let's say at the period prior to World War II, discrimination in the non-profit sector was even greater than in the profit sector, and the government being part of the non-profit sector would be part of that. Of course, the non-profit sector lacks the same incentive to hire people from minority backgrounds. It is, in fact, the opportunity to make more profit by hiring with less regard to those things. That is the driving factor that tends to erode this. When you have an agency that is non-profit, of course, they have no incentive. They may choose to hire only Scandinavians, even if that means a 20% higher pay scale to get all their jobs filled with Scandinavians. Because if, for example, they're a public utility, that means they simply pass that on to the customers who have no choice but to pay it.
Well, you maintained, you said an extraordinary figure that there were only 3 PhDs in the 1930s, whereas by contrast there were 300 practicing chemists.
Yes, among blacks.
Did you mean 3 PhDs in chemistry departments?
No, I meant 3 PhDs, 3 black PhDs,
Yeah.
teaching in non-black colleges in the 1930s.
In any field?
In any field. And the first black professor at a major university was hired in 1940 at the University of Chicago. So that this is, and Jews also were excluded from many top colleges and universities during the same era. Again, non-profit organizations can afford to do this. When there's profit, the cost of doing it is much higher. It would be very hard, for example, for a basketball owner, no matter how racist he was, to try to operate without blacks.